So we normally do podcasts, and today we've got really a special type podcast. We're going to call this an interview that we're going to be sharing with students in our school corporations. So David Morkal, want to
Yep.
welcome you
Thank you.
back to Evansville
Yeah,
and for joining us. And we appreciate you taking the time to do this.
it was my pleasure.
So why don't we do this first of all, just and I know we're going to go through a lot of things, Dave, but you're currently a battalion chief in
Mhm.
the New York City Fire Department.
Yep.
But let's kind of back up a little bit and go back a ways because you're here in town as a graduate and alumni of the University of Evansville.
Yep.
So maybe you want to talk to us a little bit to start with about, because this is going to be seen by high school students, maybe middle school students who, are thinking about down the road college and that. What took you to U of E? What were you thinking at that time your life had ahead of you?
Yeah. And it goes back to, first, my dad was in the Air Force and we moved every 4 years. And so that, learning new places and new experiences was kind of part of my blood. We moved from Southern California, where, the weather's always the same. There's no thunderstorms, no tornadoes, no snow, to north central Indiana when I was 10. And I remember the first thunderstorm I ever experienced was just mind blowing. And so moved to north central Indiana where we have lots of snow and school buses and cornbread and fried fish. Totally different experience for me than I'd ever had. But that transition, and when I was a sophomore in high school, trying to figure out who I was going to be, where I was going to go, how I was going to fit in. Basketball really wasn't going to work well for me since my first foray into basketball, I bounced the ball off of the side of my foot and out of bounds and spent the rest of the time on the bench. So I wasn't going to be that short forward or guard. That wasn't going to happen. I weighed 105 pounds. Football, not going to happen, but I did wrestle. And we were taking a break during wrestling practice one day and went into the auditorium or the cafeteria, and the drama teacher made us get up and audition. She said, if you're going to be in here, you're going to audition. So we got up and auditioned, and I ended up with 4 bit parts in the school play, and that began my love of theater. And so she was actually an Evansville native and was teaching theater. And when I started thinking about studying theater in college, she said, University of Evansville, no doubt, no question. So that's where I applied. And it was a great, great, great experience for me.
So you were a student at U of E, obviously active in drama productions, that type of thing. And at that time, as a U of E student, what did you think? If we could go back to your time in college, what did you think your future was going to hold, or what did you hope it was going to hold at that time?
Yeah, well, I came here thinking I was going to be an actor. There was some great, I'm looking at some of the people that were performing going, I don't know if I can do that. They're really, really good.
Sure.
Even some of the freshmen that I had come in with had tremendous experience and talent. And one of the things that we had to do is we had to work in all aspects of the theater. And I would work in a scene shop because I had some skills with carpentry, thanks to my dad. And so I'm working in the scene shop, building sets. And within a couple months, the technical director asked me if I was interested in a paid assistantship to work in a shop. And I was like, you're going to pay me to do what I'm doing already? I thought about that for about 2 seconds and said yes. And so that kind of began my transition to technical theater and design. Because
the behind the scenes type.
Yeah, behind the scenes stuff. Mm-hmm. So pretty much if it wasn't an actor or a costume, that's what we worked on. And, one of the professors that came in my sophomore year again, Joe Flauto, who still lives here in Evansville, he became a mentor for me and saw something, skill, talent, tenacity, I don't know. But he worked with me and really was my mentor through the rest of college in terms of developing as a designer and technical director.
So you graduate from U of V,
Yep.
and I know, and you even had some brief teaching stints too, right, at U
Yeah.
of V and Western Michigan
Yep.
University, I
Correct.
believe. But at some point along the way, you made the decision to leave the Midwest and head to New York City. So
Yeah.
talk to us a little bit about that. What led you there? What
Yeah.
you were thinking at that time?
Yeah. So I did. I graduated with a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in theater. Worked around the country in Utah and Cleveland. Went to school for a year down at University of Georgia. Worked at Hope Summer Repertory Theater in Holland, Michigan. The Evansville Civic Theater here. I was a designer and technical director for a year. And came back, was asked to come back and teach here at U of E for a year, which was a phenomenal experience. And then the next summer, I met my wife to be at Hope Summer Repertory Theater. I'd already been hired to teach at Western Michigan University for a year. So I went there and taught for a year. And then my wife was from New Jersey and had gone to NYU Tisch School as an actress. And she had an apartment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. So we moved there. And, that's what took me to New York.
And so at this point, I still don't hear you saying I wanted a career as a firefighter.
Yeah,
so that hasn't come up yet. You're in your late 20s at this point.
Yeah, in fact, before I had moved to New York, I had visited someone, and I was standing in the balcony of the apartment overlooking Broadway at one point, and saw a fire truck go up Broadway, and thought, I hate to be a firefighter here in New York. That's got to be a challenge. But and I was doing theater. I was working around the city, New York Public Theater, Shakespeare in the Park, Second Stage on the Upper West Side. Landed a job at a small shop down the Lower East Side of Manhattan. But it was a little different because I wasn't part of the process of how we were going to affect society, what we were going to say, how we wanted the audience to feel. I was really just a carpenter, making $10 an hour, working 60 hours a week. And I was like, yeah, I'm missing something here. So I did that for a while, and I was actually, we moved to Queens, and I can get into that if you want. I'll go into that story of how I ended up in the fire department.
Sure, yeah. So what all of a sudden happens that you start to become a firefighter?
In February of 1987, we're living in Queens. It's about 10 degrees out, 9 o'clock at night, and there's a manhole fire in front of our apartment. And, smoke coming out of the street, and the fire department shows up and they do their thing. They check the surrounding properties, make sure everything's okay. And when things started to quiet down, they leave, except for one guy who's standing outside, kind of watching the manhole, waiting for the utility companies to come and, take care of it. And so I'm like, well, that's odd. And so I go out and I start talking to him, and it turns out that the filing for the fire department test was that 2 weeks. So the filing, or the application process to get into the fire department, was that 2 weeks. And then there's a written test and a physical test to come. But you had to apply before your 29th birthday. And I was 28, and I would turn 29 in 3 months. So I was like, this is interesting. That would be a way to affect society, working as a firefighter. So I said to my wife, I'm going to see what's up with this. She's like, what? I said, well, we'll just see what happens. Yeah, we'll just see. So the next day I pull out the phone book, because this is before the internet.
Right.
Look through the blue pages of the New York City phone book and find a phone number for the New York City Fire Department, and figure, this is usually when you try and make a phone call to New York City agencies, it just never goes well. Either it rings and rings, or you get transferred to multiple different places. So the guy picks up on the second ring and says, what can I do for you? I said, well, I'm looking for an application for the firefighter's exam. He says, what's your address? I'll mail it to you. Sure you will. but he does. And I get it in the mail. I fill it out, send it in. And one time I called up and asked, what's the story? And, when's the test? And he says, well, we don't know anything, but if you get the chief newspaper, which is the civil service newspaper, take a look in that, and anything we know will be in there. Great. So go up, pick it up. Nothing on the test except on the back page, there's a little tiny ad that for a preparation class that starts that night in Queens. So that was the first incredible coincidence of a phenomenal journey that led me to get hired in August of 1990.
So I guess you would be a great example of someone who has had a lot of interesting stops, great experience at U of E, thinking your life's going to go down one path,
Yep.
and then not necessarily being able to predict the opportunities that are going to just, by almost chance, it sounds like, unfold before your very eyes.
Yep.
And next thing you know, here you are as a firefighter in New York City.
Yeah. Yeah. Keep your head up. Pay attention. Opportunities present themselves, and you can't take advantage of them if you don't see them coming.
Well, I think that's great advice. Before we get into some of the positions you've held, leadership in the fire department, what it's like there, if you would, Dave, kind of set the stage for us, the setting of New York City, because for many of our students, maybe who've, obviously you see New York a lot of times on film and television, but maybe you haven't had a chance to visit there. So I believe you told me, 30 years or so, roughly thereabouts, you've been working and living in that area. So talk to us, what's it like to spend your time in New York City, not just as a tourist or a visitor, but actually someone who lives there?
Yeah, it's pretty, it's incredibly exciting, and it's just nonstop. And I remember when I first moved there, for the first couple of weeks, I just had headaches from reading all the signs that, of all the stores and looking at everything. And you just have to get to a point where you can't read everything. You get into the flow of things. And, you can visit New York and spend a week there and not even touch all the great, incredible things that you can experience. You come and you stay in Midtown Manhattan at a hotel, and you go to the theater and you eat great food, but you haven't seen the Noguchi Museum in Queens. You haven't gone to the cloisters in the top of Manhattan. You haven't gone to explored all of Central Park. You haven't taken a boat ride around Manhattan. You haven't gone downtown to Wall Street to think about what it was like during the revolutionary times. To go to Brooklyn and realize that that's where Washington fought against the British and had to get across the river and then make his way up Manhattan to escape. Those are things that you haven't been able to do because you're doing those other things, the top of the World Trade Center, the Statue of Liberty, Broadway, off-Broadway, comedy shows. There's just so much to experience in New York.
Sure. What about the people as far
People
as...
are,
Yeah.
Everybody thinks, New Yorkers, but...
Right. Yeah, that is something.
Yeah.
People talk about
Yeah.
that. How would you describe New Yorkers? Because now you are a New Yorker.
Yeah. And, maybe I've seen it, so it's not just me, but New Yorkers love to help tourists, as long as you're not in the way during rush hour.
Sure.
I'll be walking down the street and I'll see somebody pull out a map, and I'll frequently stop and say, can I help you find something? And at first they're a little like, what do you want from us? But then, they get it. And maybe it's my Hoosier upbringing that,
Right.
Brings that,
Right.
to the streets. So
I want to definitely, because I know students want to hear about some of the experiences that you've had, and I'm sure they're wondering if we could talk about September 11th, that type of thing. But if we could, just one more thing I'd like to ask you about. If I know you're so good at speaking about leadership and hoping that can have an impact on people. When you speak about that, you've had a lot of leadership opportunities within the fire department in New York City. So could you just spend a moment just talking about, how that's evolved throughout your career?
Well, the first 11 years of my career as a firefighter was pretty routine and pretty, basic.
It was at a station in Manhattan?
Well, I was assigned to a firehouse in Long Island City, Queens,
Okay.
Which was a great place to work. We had a little bit of everything in terms of the type of buildings. Got to experience things like the we would have to go to the southern end of Roosevelt Island, which is in the middle of the East River, and do brand patrol for the fireworks. So I got to be like underneath the fireworks in the East River on the 4th of July, which was incredible. We also had a foam unit that we would have, and so we would have to take that and go to the South Street heliport when the president would come to town. So we would be set up just in case his helicopter crashed so that we could put the fire out. And so I got to meet, President Bush at the time, Bush Sr. We responded to the airports with our foam unit. And one time an L-1011 crashed at Kennedy Airport. All the people were able to get off, but I ended up in the plane with the foam line in the fuselage extinguishing fire, which was like, how do you get to experience that? What a privilege to be in that position, to be able to do that. Then I transferred up to the top of Manhattan because we bought a house upstate, my wife and I.
Which is not uncommon. People living, you're
Right.
talking about a little bit out of the city, and then you commute in.
Yep. I mean, we call it upstate, but anybody that actually lives upstate laughs at us because it's only 25 miles north of the city.
As opposed to somebody living in an apartment actually in the city.
In the city, correct. Now, and my wife was pregnant with our first, and so we wanted to raise our children with a yard. And so we bought a house upstate. And so I transferred to a firehouse that would be a little closer commute for me. So the top of Manhattan, engine 95 and ladder 36. And I worked in the engine company there for 4 years. And then after I'd taken the test for lieutenant, I transferred across the floor to the truck company. A little different responsibility. And if I was going to be a lieutenant, I really needed to have the experience of both types of companies. So that was my first 11 years. And then I was out in New Jersey on September 10th, helping my father-in-law, well, not helping him, actually doing the job of changing his sliding glass door in his house. And I installed it that day and then stayed over that night. And we were in the lumber yard on September 11th in the morning when I heard about the attacks on the World Trade Center. And at first it was, talk about a small plane and, I had a T-shirt that said I was a firefighter, an FDNY firefighter. And they were like, "Are you going to have to go in?" I was like, probably not, because 93 bombing, we didn't get recalled. So if a small plane crashed into the World Trade Center, I don't think so. And then I got back in the car and turned on the radio and found out it was not a small plane. It was a large plane. And there was a full recall of all firefighters. So 10,000 firefighters were going to work.
So everyone, when the first plane hit, once they knew what had happened, anyone who was a firefighter was called in, whether they were working that day or not.
Yeah, well, I think it was probably after the second plane hit because they happened so quickly, to each other. And I think that everybody was still trying to figure out, at headquarters what was going on. Certainly the firefighters that responded from the radio reports early on knew that it was a terrorist attack. Okay. One of the officers in one of the companies actually transmitted over the radio to everybody to be advised this is a terrorist attack.
Was that after the first plane or after the second? So
after the first plane.
For so many of us, I think it took that second plane to hit him before those type of thoughts came. But people you knew actually thought after the first one that there's no way that could have happened if it wasn't terrorist related.
Correct. So after that, after the second plane hit, then we were recalled. I was an hour.
What is it like going into the city as you're going in, not knowing what you're going to face other than what you've heard has happened?
Yeah, and I hadn't seen anything yet. I hadn't seen any images. And I'm an hour and a half out of the city. I had a 1982 Honda Civic, and the clutch was burning pretty good by the time I hit the highway. And I'm racing through, down the highway into the city. So I have to go across the Tappan Zee Bridge to get down into the city. The George Washington Bridge was completely closed. And as I came across Tappan Zee Bridge, there was a line of fire trucks from Westchester that had just gotten on the highway that were being called in mutual aid to help and they were going to actually to firehouses in the Bronx because we needed to be able to protect the rest of the city too. And so I figured, great, I'll just slide in with these guys and, cruise into the city. And there was no traffic going into the city at that time, at that point. And they were fire trucks, so they can't really go that fast. And I wanted to go faster. So I got out of that line and went on. But when I got into the Bronx, the traffic backed up and it was coming to a complete standstill. So I got off and I parked my car in some side street in the Bronx, just left it there, and ran down Broadway into Manhattan, which was completely gridlocked. Get into Manhattan, which is where my firehouse was, northern Manhattan. And as soon as I got there, the captain said, nobody else leaves. Everybody else stays here. Because some guys were coming in, grabbing
Stays at the firehouse.
A lot of guys were coming in, grabbing a gear and heading down.
Sure.
And so I stayed there, and then the department started to get a little bit more organized and get buses to be able to pick up crews and take them down to the site because they knew this was not going to be a quick thing. And I had heard about the collapses in the car, and I figured it was top 10 floors or something like that. I had no idea.
That's true, because with you coming from an hour and a half out of town battling traffic, I guess had both towers fell by the time you actually made it into the city.
Yeah, both towers were down. And then when I got to the firehouse, I saw the first images of what had happened. And understand, when I came across the Tappan Zee Bridge, you could see all the way down the Hudson River, and I could see the smoke from the...
I was going to ask you, as you were coming, I would imagine that's a vivid image you have of the first sight you had of the smoke coming out of the city.
Yeah, there was a lot of smoke, but it was 35 miles away.
Sure.
And so you couldn't really see what had happened, but you knew there was smoke and nothing on the radio but reports. But of course, it's radio.
Do you think most first responders did not envision there was any way the towers could have come down, even knowing that an airliner crashed into them? Do you think that was even a surprise for first responders, that something like that? Because I know you were used to seeing those towers above the skyline for the entire time you'd lived there.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I'm sure that some people were talking about the buildings coming down. Interesting that the lieutenant, or the firehouse that I worked as a lieutenant, they survived. They were in the North Tower, and the lieutenant that was working with them that day had responded to the 93 bombing. So this was his second trip to the, attacks at the World Trade Center.
And that bombing you're referring to, I believe it was a bomb underneath the tower, correct? But
with the intention,
terrorist related, and the intention was to make the buildings collapse. Okay.
And so, but as soon as the South Tower collapsed, I think they were on the 30th floor or something like that of the North Tower, and he said, "Time to go." And he got the guys out, and they got out and were kind of gathering themselves together, sitting on the back bumper of one of the fire engines underneath the North Bridge, which went from the World Financial Center into the North Tower. And one of the senior firefighters says, "We can't be here. We need to move." And so got them moving north. And, a couple minutes after they started moving north, the North Tower came down. And had they stayed there, they would have died. But they survived. And, so did anybody think that they were going to come down? I'm sure somebody did. Was it a possibility that was lingering in their mind? Yeah, I think that probably was, but it was so far out of reality that nobody could pull up that memory slide that said, "Oh yes, this is what's going to happen next."
Right. And I know, anytime we think about first responders, and that certainly includes firefighters, police officers, and paramedics, everyone that was responding to a scene like that, you just think of these acts of heroism.
Yeah.
Couple of things come to mind to you when you think of heroic acts. I don't even know how you narrow that down, because everyone was a hero that was working during the days following that. But any personal stories you have of someone that just stands out, or people that you knew, worked with?
Well, when we finally got down there that night and we got into the site, everybody was so numb and so exhausted and there was so little we could actually do because the scale of it was so massive. 10 feet of rubble on West Street. These girders that were just so huge that working with the steel workers to cut them up and try and move them. And there's a story about a lieutenant that, I wasn't there, but this lieutenant from one of the engine companies, when the South Tower collapsed and he was trapped and his company was talking to him and he's trapped and he had to order them to leave and leave him because he knew the North Tower was coming down. And so they didn't want to leave, but he ordered them to leave, knowing that if they stayed, they were going to die. And so they did leave. They survived, and the lieutenant died when the North Tower came down.
Wow. How many days after, talk to us now, if you would, just about, for people in the city, for people in your positions. I mean, when you think of not only the days, but the weeks following that, I mean, what was life like trying to, I say cleanup? I know the cleanup took months and months and months, but I mean, how do you, after such a horrific act, an incident like that, how does a city even begin to come to life again?
Yeah, it didn't for a while. I mean, everything was focused on that. We were working 24-hour shifts, 24 on, 24 off. So I was off on Wednesday and back in the firehouse on Thursday. And because of the recall, we had twice as many firefighters in the firehouse than we would need for the fire engines and fire trucks. So we split the company. So half the company was on the fire trucks and fire engines, and half a company was available as a manpower or crews to go down to work the site. Mm-hmm. Because we still had to provide protection for the rest of the city.
Yeah, things don't stop for firefighters and the rest of the city, do
right.
they?
It's not like the fire says, "Oh, well, you guys are busy, so I won't burn today."
Sure.
Everything's happening, so we won't have a car accident. We won't have medical emergencies or heart attacks or anything else. So we still had to do that, and that was a challenge in itself to keep people focused on that job because we were so focused on the trade center. And maybe this is one of my first leadership moments that I can remember, but I remember going around the firehouse turning the TVs off, saying, we have to focus on this part. We have to be able to do this because everybody was just in a different world. And then I was off on Friday. Friday night, I got a call that I was getting promoted to lieutenant on Sunday. That was late at night and wasn't a text message. We didn't have that yet. It was the old, answering machines,
right,
with the small little cassette tapes. And called back the woman, Maria, who left a message at 10 o'clock at night. And she was still there taking phone calls. So worked Saturday at the firehouse, but was a part of the crews that would go down to the site, went down to the site, worked that night, that afternoon and that night. And at about 5 o'clock in the morning, they ordered anybody getting promoted off the pile. So cleaned up, went back down to headquarters for promotion. It was supposed to be a private ceremony, but ended up being a not only public ceremony, but a nationally televised event. And you could probably Google the video of the promotion ceremony. My wife and kids were not coming because it was supposed to be a private ceremony. And that was all the way up. And it wasn't going to be a celebration. It was, it was business. And so not the same type of experience it should have been as a promotion. But I did have two friends who were U of E alumni that lived in Brooklyn, and I called them up and they came to be there for me. And then afterwards, after the promotion, they said, here's your shirt and here's your lieutenant's bars. Go be a leader. And it's like, what? So I was out in the field worked a couple of hot firehouses, then ended up down at the trade center for 5 or 6 weeks, and then rotated back out to the field. And we were either working or going to funerals with 343 members that died in the fire department, we were going to 3 or 4 funerals a day. So if you weren't working, you were going to a funeral. And that was kind of a blur. And then you could see, the rest of the world. The farther away from New York you lived, the sooner you got back to normal.
Sure.
And then in New York City, when the smoke stopped coming off of the pile, then more and more of New York City started going back to normal. We were still stuck in that world. And it was a while. And we were my wife and I and the kids were down in Florida when my wife said, "You need to go see a therapist." And that helped a lot. So,
Well, after everything you had been through and the intensity of it, I mean, I can imagine that. So when you are in that area now and you see the Memorial Plaza area and you see the new building, and you think back and reflect on those days that I'm sure are a blur now in some ways, what kind of emotions come when you see what it looks like now today, and you see people paying their respects and their tributes and that type of thing?
Well, it's sacred ground. Gettysburg is sacred ground. This is sacred ground. Culloden Battlefield in Scotland is sacred ground. When you lose that many lives in one area, you can feel, the souls. I don't know. I remember the first anniversary of the attacks, and when we went there for the memorial, it was still a pit. Sure. They had excavated, and it was fascinating as they're reading the names. It was a windy day, and the wind blowing across the microphones sounded like buildings coming down. And as we walked down into the pit to the bottom, and as we're walking down and other firefighters are walking out in their dress blue uniforms, covered in dust from the wind that kicked up, reminded me of that night as we were walking into the pit and, into the site, and firefighters that had been working all day were walking off and they had so much dust on their bunker gears. That connection was
wow.
Certainly effective.
Wow. For, when you think about it, that was an interesting story you talked about turning the TVs off, one of your early acts of leadership. Just for students as they're looking ahead in their lives, what kind of advice do you give about what does it mean to be a leader? And when you reflect back on your career and your experiences, how would you explain and guide them on what type of things leaders do?
When I got sent out as a lieutenant to be the leader, I really didn't know what I was going to be doing. Usually there's
it didn't come with a manual.
No manual. And usually there's a class, which is, there was some leadership conversations, but it's mostly administrative and managerial, not leadership. But we didn't even have that. And I look back and I realize that was a transition for me to become an intentional student of leadership. If you want to be a leader, you can't just sit back and wait for someone to hand you the Leadership 101 book. You have to go looking for those leadership lessons. And the more you look, the more obvious they become. And the more you ask, the more leaders will give you their input. And different leadership lessons affect different leaders in different ways. So there is that, I can give a leadership class and it'll affect every one of the students that I give the class to differently. And they'll take different nuggets from what I say and different perspectives, and just from the way that the life that they've led and the experiences they've had to get to that point will give them a different way of hearing what I have to say. And, the students that listen to this, different students will hear different things, which is great because there is no cookie cutter leadership mold. Everybody brings something different and a different way to be a leader. But you have to be intentional about learning about it, and you have to actually go out and pull on the rope of leadership lessons instead of just waiting for someone to push a rope at you.
I think that's a great way to wrap up this interview. We've
Great.
taken a lot of your time. You've been so gracious to share not only your thoughts on leadership and keeping your eyes open for those opportunities that you don't anticipate, but we certainly appreciate, Dave, you taking the time to talk to us about that tragic event of 9/11 that, our students now, that is history for them because they weren't here when 9/11 took place. So it truly is history for them, and I think you've done a great job of bringing that to light. So we thank you for doing that.
It's been my pleasure. And, the World Trade Center attacks is, it's part of my soul. It's part of my life. And if any of the students get a chance to go down to the memorial to spend some time there, I just spend some time and think about what that was and how many lives were affected, and learn some lessons from that experience, and connect with the spirit of that sacred ground.
Well said. Thank you so much, Battalion Chief, New York City Fire Department, Dave Morkal, U of E, proud U of E, University of Evansville ace alumni. So thanks so much for taking the time to share this great information.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Thank you.